The night the grain store caught fire, the woman who had not spoken in 15 years cried out at last, and the only man who understood that cry was the widowed colonel who had bought her for 1 silver coin. And if you stay with me, I'll tell you what broke her voice as a child, why it stayed locked away for so long, and why the whole town later watched her stand where she had once been priced like an object. But that word in the fire did not begin in flames. It began in the market square of Antequera in Oaxaca in the year 1761, under a noon sun so harsh it made the white walls sting the eyes. The square was crowded that day. Women sold embroidered cloth bright as parrots, men stacked wicker baskets, chickens flapped in reed cages, and the air carried roasted corn, horse sweat, dust, and the sweet bite of ground spices. Right in the middle of all that trade stood a rough wooden platform where human lives were being counted out like sacks of grain. The man responsible for the sale was Fulgencio Restrepo, owner of 3 inherited haciendas and a temper everyone in the region knew well. He liked quick business, easy profit, and anything that could be turned into money before supper. That morning he had decided to liquidate a lot of 7 enslaved people. The auctioneer, Hermogenes Pacheco, had spent 20 years shouting prices over the noise of markets just like this one. He knew how to flatter a buyer, how to hide a flaw, how to make urgency sound like opportunity. Even so, when his eye drifted to the end of Restrepo's line, his voice slowed for a moment. There she stood, Belisaria Tunjano, 22 years old, thin at the wrists where old chain scars still showed pale against her skin, with a face so still it unsettled people more than weeping would have done. Beside her stood Eulalia, an older enslaved woman from the same lot, whispering little comforts that received no answer. Belisaria had not spoken a single word in 15 years. Men in broad hats looked at her, then looked away. A young hacendado named Zuniga, searching for labor for a newly acquired indigo ranch, asked the question others were thinking. Was she ill? Was she witless? Hermogenes wiped his brow and said, No sickness, strong hands, sound body, only a voice locked away. The bidding began elsewhere. Casimiro, a broad-shouldered man, was sold quickly for work in a nearby mine. A sewing girl of 16 went to the wife of a cloth merchant. Eulalia found a buyer too, a family wanting an experienced caretaker for young children. Then Belisaria was pushed gently forward into the full glare of the square. Hermogenes lifted his hand and called the opening price, 5 pesos, and not a single person answered. If this kind of story stays with you, subscribe and listen on, because what happened after those 5 pesos changed both their lives forever. The silence after those 5 pesos was ugly in a way only a market can be ugly, just full of small cruelties. A man near the spice stall clicked his tongue. Someone laughed through his nose. A buyer shifted, the way men do when they have already decided a body is worth less than a mule with a lame leg. On the platform, Belisaria did not lower her eyes. She stood in the hard glare with her hands loose at her sides, while Hermogenes Pacheco forced a smile back onto his face and tried again. 4 pesos, he called, wiping sweat from his neck with a cloth that had long ago given up any hope of staying clean. Still nothing. The smell of roasted corn drifted across the square. A child cried somewhere near the wicker baskets. Chickens beat their wings against cane slats. Life went on around that platform, with the same terrible calm, as if the refusal of a human being were no more serious than a bruised melon left unsold at day's end. Restrepo's jaw tightened. He had inherited 3 haciendas from his father, and liked to speak as though everything under his hand turned to profit. This was turning into embarrassment instead. He glanced once at Belisaria with the impatience of a man who hated being reminded that he had misjudged the value of his own lot. Hermogenes tried 3 pesos, then 2. By then, the others had all found buyers. Casimiro was led away first, bought for labor in a nearby mine, his wrists tied with fresh cord before the dust had even settled under his feet. The sewing girl, barely 16, was claimed by the wife of a cloth merchant who pinched her fingertips and nodded, pleased by their neatness. Eulalia, after one last look at Belisaria, went with a family seeking someone steady enough to mind young children. The older woman's lips moved as she passed, maybe a blessing, maybe a farewell. Belisaria watched her go and gave nothing away. That was the part people in the square remembered later. She did not beg when left alone. A young hacendado named Zuniga, the one looking for workers for his indigo ranch, asked again whether the woman could hear. Hermogenes answered sharply that she heard very well. Cooked, cleaned, carried, obeyed. She simply never spoke. 15 years, he added, trying to make the mystery sound valuable. Not a word in 15 years. That only made things worse. Men who would buy stubbornness, grief, even visible fear, wanted no part of a voice locked away for reasons they could not measure. Hermogenes drew a breath and said the number no seller likes to say in public. 1 silver coin. For a heartbeat, even the flies seemed to hang still in the heat. Then, from the rear of the crowd, a man's voice answered, low and certain. I'll give it. People turned at once. Through the shoulders and hats stepped a tall officer in a dark blue colonial army coat, its cuffs dusty from the road. He was around 45, his hair touched with gray at the temples, and a thin scar crossed his left eyebrow like an old line cut by a knife and healed badly. Everyone in Antequera grew him on sight. Colonel Leoncio Madariaga, commander of the military detachment of the region, widower for 3 years, a man who did not waste words. Hermogenes blinked. Did your excellency say 1 silver coin? Madariaga came closer, boots striking the packed earth with calm finality. His gaze rested on Belisaria only a moment, but it was a strange look. Not the look of a buyer amused by a bargain. Then he reached for the sale register. The square seemed to lean in when Colonel Leoncio Madariaga laid his hand on the register. Even Hermogenes, who had seen every kind of buyer in 20 years, looked at him with open surprise. 1 silver coin sat in the colonel's gloved palm, dull in the sun, hardly more than a token. Yet somehow the little piece of silver silenced the muttering better than a purse of gold might have done. Restrepo found his voice first. Colonel, that woman is mute, he said, as though the warning might still save the officer from foolishness. She has been that way for years. Madariaga did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the page while Hermogenes turned it toward him. The sale entry was there in a hurried hand, smudged by dust and sweat. Belisaria, age 22, sound body, no speech. The colonel read every word, then took the pen. The faint scent of ink and hot leather rose between them. Around the platform, men waited for a joke, a shrug, some sign that he was acting on a whim. What they got instead was a quiet, finished motion. He signed his name and placed the coin down on the wood. Sold, Hermogenes said at last, striking the board with the handle of his gavel. A few men laughed under their breath. Zuniga smiled the way young men smile when they think an older man has made a sentimental mistake. Restrepo snatched up the coin with 2 fingers, as if it offended him to touch it, and turned away, already barking at a servant to clear the platform. For him, the matter was done. A troublesome piece of property had been removed from his accounts. For Belisaria, it was something stranger. She stepped down from the boards with the same controlled stillness she had held all morning. But now she stood before a man who did not smell of cane fields or wine. He smelled of saddle soap, iron, sun-warmed wool, and the long road. Up close, she could see the scar that crossed his left eyebrow, pale against weathered skin, and the threads of gray at his temples. He was about 45, broad in the shoulders still, though grief had left a kind of weariness around his mouth. "What name do you answer to?" he asked. It was a simple question, no edge in it, no mockery, just a man asking as if the answer mattered. She did not speak. The sounds of the market came back around them in a rush, vendors calling, chickens complaining, someone shaking roasted corn from a pan. Belisaria met his gaze for one long moment. There was no fear in her face that he could read, though he did notice the old marks circling her wrists. At last Hermogenes cleared his throat and pointed to the register. "Belisaria, Colonel. That is the name listed." Madariaga repeated it softly, as though testing whether it belonged to her. "Belisaria." Again, no answer. He gave a slight nod, simply decided. "Come with me." That was all. No rope, no shove, no order shouted for others to drag her along. He turned, and after the briefest pause, she followed him through the market crowd toward the far side of the square, where his horse waited in the heat beside a young soldier. And when she saw the direction he meant to take her, toward the road leading up from the town to the military quarter, and beyond it the too-quiet house where no woman's voice had been heard in 3 years, something moved behind her eyes for the first time. That flicker in her eyes was gone again by the time they reached the horse, but Madariaga had seen it. He said nothing. The young soldier holding the reins stepped aside at once, and the colonel chose not to mount. Instead, he took the bridle in his own hand and led the animal through the street on foot, as if he understood that forcing her to ride behind him through town would turn every doorway into a place of staring. So they walked. The late sun had begun to soften, but the stones still held the day's heat. Dust clung to the hem of Belisaria's skirt. Church bells rang somewhere uphill, slow and bronze deep, and with every turn of the road, the market noise thinned behind them. They passed shuttered shops, a fountain green with damp around its base, and houses where women paused in doorways to watch the colonel go by with the silent woman he had purchased for 1 silver coin. Some recognized her from the auction, some recognized only him. Either way, she felt their eyes. Madariaga's house stood a little apart from the busiest streets, solid and plain, with whitewashed walls that caught the afternoon light, and windows crossed with black iron bars. It was not grand in the manner of the great hacienda houses. It was kept, orderly, almost severe. Inside the front gate lay a central patio cooled by shade and stone, with a cistern, clay pots, and a lemon tree whose branches reached over the paving like a hand spread in blessing. The leaves gave off a clean, bitter scent when the breeze moved through them. Belisaria stopped there for half a breath. There are places that speak before the people inside them do. This one said, absence. The air carried no child's laughter, no woman's sewing basket set carelessly on a bench, no second pair of footsteps crossing from one room to another. It was the too-quiet house of a man who had been living beside memory for longer than he had been living beside hope. Madariaga seemed to hear that same silence as he opened the door to the main room. On one wall hung a crucifix. On another, in a narrow carved frame, was the portrait of a young woman with calm eyes and a lace collar. The paint had darkened with years, but tenderness still lived in the face. Belisaria did not need anyone to tell her who it was. "My wife," he said, following her gaze. "Casimira." His voice lowered after the name, not with display, simply with habit. He set his hat on a table near the wall. "She died 3 years ago. Fevers. 4 days, and then the house changed." Belisaria looked back at him. He was not asking pity. He was placing truth in the room before giving orders in it. "We had no children," he added, as if finishing an account long since closed. He led her along a short corridor where the air smelled faintly of soap, dried herbs, and old plaster warmed through by the day. At the far end, beside the kitchen, he opened a small chamber. Inside stood a narrow bed, a stool, a wash basin, and a little shelf built into the wall. Through the single window, she could see a strip of the patio and one low branch of the lemon tree moving in the breeze. "This will be yours," he said. Then his eyes dropped briefly to her wrists. The old chain scars had slipped into view again where her sleeve had fallen back. His face changed, only slightly, but enough for her to notice. What he said next was the first thing in 15 years that made her lift her head, as though she had not heard him correctly. He said, very simply, "In this house, no one will strike you for failing to speak." The words landed in the little chamber with more force than a shout might have had. Belisaria did not move at once. Her face stayed composed, but something in her shoulders changed, a faint loosening, as though a cord pulled too tight had eased by the width of a finger. Men had spoken to her before with commands, with mockery, with impatience. No one had ever spoken to her like that, as if silence might be endured without punishment. Madariaga stepped back from the doorway, giving her room in a way she had not expected. "You would work here," he went on, his tone even. "Kitchen, washing, whatever is needed. I do not require chatter. I require care." He paused, then added, "If there is something you wish me to understand, you may find your own way." Then he left her there, with the fading light and the soft kitchen smells beyond the wall. For a long while she stood in the small room without sitting. The air held lime wash, dry wood, and the faint sharpness of onions stored nearby. Through the window came the evening rustle of leaves in the patio tree and the distant murmur of town life settling toward night. At last she crossed into the kitchen. It was a working room, plain but well kept. Copper pots hung in order. A stone metate sat near the wall. Dried peppers were braided by the door. She opened the pantry, expecting the same bare staples she had seen in other houses, beans, lard, coarse flour, and stopped. On a shelf lay cinnamon sticks wrapped in cloth. Beside them, cloves in a glazed jar. Near the back, 2 vanilla pods, dark and glossy with age. She reached for them one by one, slowly, as if touching proof of a world she had once known and nearly forgotten. Their scent rose warm and deep into the quiet. Memory is a strange thing. It does not always come with words. Sometimes it comes through the hand before it reaches the heart. Standing there in that kitchen, with spice on her fingertips, Belisaria was no longer only the woman purchased for 1 silver coin. Some older part of her stirred awake. At dawn, she began to cook. She moved before the servants of neighboring houses had even thrown open their shutters, the kitchen filled with the crackle of firewood, the scrape of stone against chile and seed, the dark fragrance of toasted spices opening in heat. She ground cinnamon with pepper, worked chocolate dark sauce to silk, and built a mole the way one builds a prayer, step by step, with patience and memory. By the time Madariaga came in from the patio, washed and dressed but without his coat, the room smelled rich enough to stop a man in the doorway. He looked at the pot, then at her. "You made these?" She gave one small nod. That evening he tasted it in the dining room, where the portrait of Casimira watched from the wall. He had likely expected competence. What touched his tongue was far beyond that. The mole was deep, smoky, touched by cinnamon and chili in a way that seemed to carry distance inside it. Distance and grief and care, all in the same spoonful. He set the spoon down and looked toward the doorway where she stood. "Belisaria," he said quietly, "where did you learn to cook like this?" She did not answer with her mouth. Instead, after a still moment, she turned, went back toward the kitchen, and returned carrying 2 things from somewhere among her few belongings, a bit of colored cord and a small round token of dried river clay. He looked from the bit of cord to the clay token, and for the first time since bringing her into the house, Leoncio seemed truly puzzled. Belisaria stepped closer to the table, careful, almost formal. The cord was faded in places, but once it had been bright, red, yellow, blue, and green, twisted together from scraps too small for any seamstress to bother saving. Near one end, she had tied a single tight knot. Then, with one finger, she touched the knot, touched the bowl of mole, and finally laid her hand flat against her own chest. After that, she set down the round clay piece. It was no bigger than a biscuit, pressed smooth while wet and dried hard afterward. In its face, she had marked 3 shallow lines and 1 small spiral with her thumb. Leoncio leaned in. The candlelight warmed the brown surface and cast little shadows into the marks. He had spent years reading maps, patrol notes, supply tallies, small signs that meant danger or safety on the road. Yet this was different. This had not been made for soldiers or clerks. It had been made for survival inside a single human heart. "You are telling me something," he said softly. She gave one quick nod. He pointed to the knot. "You?" Another nod. He pointed to the bowl. "This food?" Yes again. Then to the token. At that, her gaze shifted, not away from him exactly, but beyond him, toward some place the room could not hold. Her fingers hovered over the spiral. For a moment, he thought she might take the token back and end the attempt. Instead, she tapped the mark once, then drew her hand through the air in a slow motion southward, as if tracing a road no one else could see. A lesser man might have laughed, or grown impatient, or treated the whole thing as nonsense from a broken mind. Leoncio did none of those things. He sat back, thinking. The mole still perfumed the room with cinnamon and chili, and somewhere in the patio a night insect clicked from the darkness near the cistern. "This is where you learned it," he said at last. "From before you came here." Belisaria's eyes lifted sharply to his. It was the first true answer he had received from her. The next morning, before the sun had climbed above the wall, he found her in the patio kneeling by the damp earth beside the lemon tree. A shallow bowl of river clay stood at her side. Strips of cord rested over her wrist like loose bracelets. She was shaping another token with quiet concentration, smoothing the edges with her thumb, then pressing into it the tiny leaf of an herb from the garden bed. Mint, Leoncio thought, or something close to it. The air smelled of wet soil, bitter peel, and the first clean heat of day. He did not interrupt at once. He watched long enough to see that this was no whim from the night before. It was a method. A voice, locked away, had found another road out. When she noticed him, she did not hide the clay. She placed the fresh token beside yesterday's, then picked up a green cord and tied 2 small knots near the center. After that, she rose and led him to the herb bed by the wall. There, among rosemary, rue, and a struggling basil plant, she pointed from the double knot to the leaves, then back to him. He felt almost absurdly honored by the lesson. "So this means the garden," he murmured. She gave him the slightest hint of approval, and for a brief moment, something gentler than sorrow passed over her face. That same afternoon, as if deciding he would either learn this private language properly or not at all, Leoncio cleared a space on his study table beside his military papers and waited to see what she would bring him next. What she brought him next was not one token, but a small row of them, laid out with the care of a schoolmaster arranging letters. By then the study had begun to change in subtle ways. Military reports still sat in stacked order, tied with cord and sealed in wax. Maps still lay weighted under a brass cup. Yet now, beside ink pots and folded dispatches, there was a wooden tray for drying clay, a knife for trimming frayed cord, and a shallow dish of river water she used to wet her thumbs before pressing marks into the soft, round pieces. Late afternoon light slanted through the shutters, warm and gold, touching both his official papers and her private signs, as if the room had decided to make space for them equally. Belisaria placed 3 green knotted cords on the table. One had a single knot near the middle, one had 2 close together, one had 3, spaced wider apart. Then she set down matching tokens. Into the first she had pressed a mint leaf, into the second a broken rosemary sprig, into the third the narrow tip of rue. The scent rose faintly where the marks had been made, sharp and living. Leoncio watched with the patience of a man who had learned that speaking less often helped him hear more. She pointed to the herb bed visible through the window, then touched each sign in turn. He repeated her lesson aloud. 1 knot, mint. A small nod. 2 knots, rosemary. Another. 3, rue. This time her mouth changed almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, something near it. Then the strange teaching began. Over the next days, the house found a new rhythm. In the morning, she worked in the kitchen or patio, skirts brushing the stone, clay under one nail, herb scent on her hands. In the evening, when Leoncio returned from the duties of the garrison, escort orders, road disputes, supply accounts, he would find something new waiting in the study. A yellow cord with a knot near the end for maize, a blue one crossed twice for water, a token marked with a tiny circle and rays for sun, another with a pressed pepper seed for heat. She was giving him nouns first, the plain bones of a language. He learned them with almost solemn attention. Some men would have treated the effort as a game. He did not. Perhaps because his own life had narrowed after Casimira's death into duty, meals, sleep, and the long breath of the too-quiet house. Perhaps because this silent exchange asked from him the very thing grief had taught him best: patience. Whatever the reason, he began to keep her signs in careful order, wrapped in linen so they would not chip. He even copied meanings in the margin of an old ledger in his neat soldier's hand. One evening, after supper, he found a new token on the table beside his cup. This one was different. No herb, no seed, no sun mark. Belisaria had pressed into the clay the rough shape of a wheel, then beside it 3 short lines trailing backward, like dust. He looked at it for a long moment while oil lamps breathed softly in the room. "A cart," he said at last. Belisaria had been standing by the doorway, half in shadow. At that word her fingers tightened around the folded apron in her hands. Leoncio lifted his eyes to her. "Does this mean travel? The market road? Something from where you came from?" She did not nod this time. Instead, slowly, she stepped forward and placed beside the wheel token another piece of clay he had never seen before, older, worn smooth at the edge from being handled many times. On it, faint but still visible, was the print of a much smaller hand, the child's hand. When Leoncio saw that, he understood he was standing at the threshold of the secret she had kept for 15 years. He did not reach for the child hand token right away. Leoncio had spent enough years around frightened horses, grieving widows, wounded soldiers, and proud men on the edge of anger to know that timing could matter as much as kindness. So he left both clay pieces on the table between them and waited. The lamp flame moved softly in its glass, breathing light over the worn print of those tiny fingers. Belisaria stood very still by the window, but the stillness was different now. He could feel effort in it. At last he said, "This was yours." Her throat moved once. No sound came. She nodded. Then she touched the wheel mark with one finger, the little hand print with another, and after that she drew 3 lines on the tabletop with the side of her thumb, quick and rough, as if cutting a road through dust. When she finished, she laid her palm flat over the child token and closed her eyes. What he understood was not the full story, not yet, but he understood enough to grow careful. "The cart took someone," he said quietly, "and you were small when it happened." This time the answer came slower, a nod, then another, sharper one, as if the truth itself had weight. The next morning, the house felt hushed in a new way. The kitchen fire snapped. Water simmered in a pot. Outside, doves muttered from the roof tiles, and the herb bed gave off its green smell after dawn watering. Belisaria worked as she always did, yet twice Leoncio saw her stop with her hands in the basin, staring into nothing. He did not press her. When he left for the barracks, he only said he would return before dark. He found a new arrangement waiting in the study that evening. There were 4 clay tokens this time: the child's hand, the cartwheel, a woman's figure marked by a braid pressed in with cord, and beside that, 2 smaller round pieces, each stamped with the tip of a child's finger. Belisaria stood across from him, pale with the strain of what she meant to show. One by one, she tapped them, herself, her mother, 2 younger children. Then she placed the wheel beside the woman's figure and pushed it away from the others. Leoncio let out a breath through his nose, slow and low. So that was it. a voice locked away on the night a mother was loaded onto a trader's cart and taken from her children. He raised his eyes to her. Your mother was sold away. Belisaria's mouth trembled before she mastered it. She took the 2 small tokens, set them near her own, then moved them apart from each other, farther and farther, until all 3 children stood alone on different corners of the table. After that, she bent her hand over the mother token and turned it face down. There are griefs that need no speech. That room held one of them. Leoncio sat with both palms on the table, looking at the scattered pieces of clay as if they were battlefield losses listed in miniature. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all trace of command. After that, you never spoke again. She did not nod this time. Instead, with fingers that had begun to shake, she reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out something he had never seen before. A length of faded red cord, with a knot tied so tight it had nearly cut into itself. The faded red cord looked as though it had been tied by desperate fingers, and never once undone. Belisaria laid it across the table between the scattered clay pieces. Then she touched the knot, pressed her hand over her own mouth, and after that pointed to the little child's handprint. It was plain enough. The vow had begun there, in childhood, on the same day the cart took her mother. Leoncio did not ask her to force the rest into signs that night. He could already feel how close to breaking the effort had brought her. So he covered the old cord gently with his palm and said only, "Enough for now." The relief that passed through her was small, but he saw it. She gathered the tokens in careful silence and carried them away to the tray by the study wall, except for the child's handprint. That one she left on his desk, beside the lamp, as if allowing him to keep one witness. After that evening, something unspoken shifted between them. Days did not become easy, exactly. Wounds carried for 15 years do not soften in a week. Yet the house began to breathe differently. In the mornings, Belisaria moved through the kitchen with more certainty, hanging strings of peppers to dry, grinding spice, lifting pot lids so steam scented with clove and onion rolled into the corridor. In the patio, she worked the herb beds with bare hands, loosening packed soil around mint and rue, pressing new cuttings into the earth. Leoncio, returning from inspections or road patrol orders, would often find a fresh clay token waiting near his plate. A pepper seed pressed into one meant heat. 3 shallow waves meant the wash basin needed filling. A cord tied in black and yellow meant a storm might come before dusk, because she had smelled it in the air. He learned quickly because he wanted to. If you think wanting to understand a person is a small thing, my friend, it is not. In many lives, it never happens at all. One evening, he came back later than usual, boots powdered with road dust, jaw tired from a day of complaints among mule drivers and soldiers. The sun had already gone down behind the tiled roofs, lamps were lit in the too quiet house, and supper waited warm under cloth. On the table beside his plate, instead of a token about food or weather, he found one pressed with the rough shape of a bed, and above it, 4 short vertical marks. He frowned, then glanced toward the doorway. Belisaria stood there with folded hands. When he pointed to the token, she lifted 4 fingers, then touched the portrait of Casimira on the wall. He understood in a slow, inward way. 4 days, the fever, the bed. For a moment he could not speak. The room smelled of broth, wax, and the faint, bitter oil of lemon leaves drifting in from the patio. No one had marked that grief back to him before. No one had said, even without words, "I see what happened here." "At times," he said quietly, "I think the house still remembers those 4 days better than I do." She did not move. Then, with unusual boldness, she stepped forward, set down one more token beside the first, and withdrew. This one bore a small pressed leaf from the patio tree, and a line beneath it, curved like the edge of shade. He stared at it, puzzled, until he realized she was telling him where she had found him the night before, sitting alone on the bench beneath the branches after supper, long after the dishes had cooled. She had noticed that too. And when Leoncio looked up from the token, intending to thank her somehow, he found that she was no longer in the doorway. She was standing nearer the portrait, her gaze fixed on Casimira's painted face, as though another question had risen in her at last. He followed her gaze to the portrait and understood, after a moment, that she was asking about the woman on the wall. The lamp gave off a faint smell of warm oil. Supper had gone nearly untouched between them. Outside, the patio leaves whispered against one another, and somewhere beyond the house, a cart rolled over stones with that hollow, wooden sound that always seemed lonelier at night. Leoncio rose, crossed to the portrait, and stood beneath it with his hands behind his back, as if reporting to someone he had once loved and could not quite stop honoring. "Her name was Casimira," he said. "She laughed more than I do. That is not difficult, I know, but she did." The corner of his mouth shifted, barely. "She could make a room feel less empty simply by walking through it." Belisaria remained near the table, the red cord still lying beside the child's handprint. She watched him closely now, the way a person watches when words matter because they are given rarely. "She fell ill in the hot season," he went on. "At first I thought it was a passing fever. By the second day she could not rise. By the fourth—" He paused there. The pause said enough. "After that, this became the too quiet house." He turned slightly, enough to glance at her. "We had hoped for children. God did not grant them." Belisaria lowered her eyes. Then, after a still breath, she crossed to the study table, gathered 3 small unused clay pieces from the tray, and set them before him. On one, she pressed the edge of her thumb, long and curved like a woman's profile. On the second, she left a plain mark, small and round. On the third, she pressed nothing at all. She set the woman-marked token near the portrait, the blank one near his hand, and the empty piece between them, apart from both. Leoncio stared at the arrangement. His face changed. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is near enough." For a while neither of them spoke, and yet something had been said. He had given her the truth of his marriage, plain and unadorned. She had answered with clay and silence and understanding. There are confessions that need no mouth. That night was built of them. After a time he moved back to the table and sat. "I have told you about her," he said. "I have told you what the house lost. I will not ask more from you tonight. But if you ever wish me to know—" He looked at the child's handprint, then at the old red knot. "I will listen." She stood very still. Then she took the blank token, turned it over, and with the point of a small knife scratched into the damp side a long, low shape, like a roofline. Beneath it, she drew 4 tiny marks close together. A shed, children hiding. He felt it at once, though he said nothing. Belisaria covered the little scratched image with her palm, as if it had been exposed too suddenly. She gathered the rest of the pieces, but not in haste. When she reached the doorway, she stopped, looked back once, and then tapped twice against the frame with one finger. Later, long after the house had gone dark, Leoncio stepped into the patio for air. The night smelled of damp stone, herbs, and the faint sweetness of lemon peel. Under the tree, he saw her sitting on the low bench, not asleep, not weeping, just working by moonlight. In her lap lay a fresh length of cord, far longer than any she had shown him before, and her hands were tying knot after knot into it with grave, patient care. By morning, he understood, she meant to tell him where her silence had truly begun. By morning, the cord was waiting for him on the study table, coiled beside the child's handprint like something taken from a wound and set out in daylight. The house was cool at that hour. Dawn had not yet burned the night out of the walls. From the kitchen came the soft thud of a pestle, the low crackle of coals being stirred, and the smell of maize warming on the griddle. Belisaria was already awake. She stood near the window of the study with the long cord in both hands, the knots spaced unevenly along it, some close as teeth, others far apart. On the table, she had arranged more tokens than ever before. A woman's mark, 3 children, the wheel, a low shed scratched with 4 tiny figures, a dark oval she had rubbed with ash until it looked almost black. Leoncio sat down without speaking. He had learned enough by then to know that if he hurried her, the thread would snap. She began with the 3 child tokens and touched the smallest one last. Then she pointed to herself, eldest. After that, she placed the woman token at the center and drew all 3 children toward it with the edge of her palm. Mother and children together. Next, she touched the shed token and tapped it twice, then spread her fingers low over the tabletop in a way that made him think of lying close to the floor, hidden, holding breath. "She kept you together as long as she could," he murmured. Belisaria's eyes lifted to his, and for an instant he knew he had followed correctly. Then she moved to the blackened token. When her finger rested on it, something in her face went distant. Slowly, she pressed that dark piece beside the wheel. Then she dragged the woman token away from the children and set it near the cart. Her hand trembled. One of the clay pieces clicked softly against the wood. The room seemed to tighten around that sound. Leoncio could see it now, in fragments, before the whole picture came clear. A plantation store shed, children hidden in it. Night, or near enough to night that memory had swallowed the color from it. Men loading a woman into a trader's cart. The eldest child watching, too young to stop it, old enough to understand that what was leaving might never return. Belisaria took up the old red cord. With both thumbs, she pressed the tight knot against the table until the skin around her nails whitened. Then she placed the cord over the child's handprint and covered both with her hand. A vow. He did not need her to shape the rest in signs. The truth had already entered the room. "That was the night," he said softly. "When they took your mother, you chose never to speak again." She closed her eyes and nodded once. For a while, neither of them moved. Through the shutters came the first bird calls from the roofline, quick and bright, almost indecent in their cheer. The smell of ground cinnamon drifted in from the kitchen where she must have been preparing breakfast before this harder task overtook her. Leoncio looked at the knots, then at her face, and what struck him most was not mystery now. It was the terrible plainness of it. A child had found the one thing no trader could seize by force, and hidden herself inside it for 15 years. At length, Belisaria opened her eyes. She touched the 3 child tokens again. One by one, she slid them apart across the table until each stood alone at a different edge. Leoncio felt the ache of that gesture before he understood its full meaning. "The others," he said. "Your brother and sister, or brothers." She tapped the smaller tokens twice. Brothers. They were taken too. This time she did not nod. She reached for a fresh piece of clay, still damp under a cloth, and with a shaking fingertip drew into it something he had not seen before. The opening of a mountain shaft. The mark of the mine was crude, just a dark opening scratched into soft clay, but it struck Leoncio harder than a cleaner drawing would have done. Belisaria pressed that token beside one of the smaller child pieces, then took the second child piece and placed it beside another mine mark she shaped quickly with her thumb. 2 brothers, 2 separate sendings, not together, never returned. The study was full of morning light by then, pale and honest, and that honesty made the little clay graves on the table seem almost unbearable. "You lost them too," Leoncio said. She did not answer in the way of nods or signs at first. She only looked down at the tiny tokens and then, very slowly, swept her hand over the whole table, over mother, brothers, cart, shed, darkness, the red knot, over all of it. When she lifted her palm again, the pieces remained, but the gesture had said what words might have said in another life. Everything had been taken apart. After that, she seemed emptied by the telling. Leoncio rose, went to the kitchen, and returned with a cup of water cooled in the earthen jar. He set it beside her without comment. She drank in small sips. The air smelled of wet clay, ground maize, and cinnamon from the morning fire. Outside in the patio, a bee worried at the herb blossoms, heedless of human sorrow. He could have asked more then. Other men would have. Which plantation? Which year? Which trader? Which route? But pain is not an account book, and he was wise enough to know that mercy often lies in stopping before a wound is torn open for the sake of knowing everything. So he did something smaller and far kinder. He gathered the tokens carefully and placed them in a shallow cedar box from his desk, one usually meant for old letters. He lined it first with clean linen. Then he set the box within her reach, not locking it, not hiding it away. "When you wish to show me more," he said, "they will be here." Belisaria looked at the box for a long moment. Then she touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, very lightly, almost like a blessing. In the days that followed, they did not return at once to the deepest part of her story. Instead, life moved around it, gentler now, though never careless. She cooked, he worked. The herbs in the patio thickened under her hands. Leoncio began bringing small things from the market without making ceremony of it. Extra cord in better colors, a smoother clay bowl, a narrow blade better suited for shaping marks. Once, a tiny bundle of cumin seeds. Another time, blue thread she did not use for sewing at all, but untwisted and added to her cords. By then she no longer stood waiting by the wall at every meal. Sometimes she remained near the doorway out of habit, but more and more often she sat on the low stool by the kitchen threshold while he ate, within easy sight of him. Once, when he pushed a plate a little closer and lifted his brows in invitation, she accepted a portion without protest. The gesture was small. In that house, it felt immense. And yet, peace, when it comes to people who have suffered under the hands of the proud, is often noticed by the very men who cannot bear to see it. News travels quickly in towns like Antequera. A captain's orderly hears something from a laundress. A muleteer repeats it to a tavern keeper. A steward carries it to a hacienda. Before long, Fulgencio Restrepo heard that the mute woman he had sold away for almost nothing was running a colonel's kitchen, tending his herbs and communicating with him through signs he bothered to learn. When that reached him, it did not stir regret. It stirred insult. Insult, in a man like Restrepo, was the beginning of trouble. Insult sat badly in Restrepo's stomach. It curdled there until it began to look, in his own mind, like justice. The news had reached him in the shaded gallery of his hacienda house while he drank thick chocolate from a silver cup and listened with half an ear to his steward's list of mule feed, broken tools, and men absent from the fields. What caught him was not the mention of Belisaria alone. It was the manner of it. The steward said the colonel let her choose herbs at market, that he listened when she showed him those queer little cords and clay pieces, that she was no longer treated as useless stock bought cheap in a bad hour, but almost as if she had judgment of her own. Restrepo set the cup down hard enough to spill it. He did not miss her. Let us be plain about that. Men like him do not mourn what they have never troubled to know. What he could not bear was something else, something smaller and uglier. He had sold away a woman for almost nothing, and another man had found value in her. Pride can live on very little, but it feeds well on resentment. So he began to ask questions. A week later, in the back room of a tavern near the mule yard, he sat with a lawyer from the capital, a narrow-faced man with careful cuffs and a habit of smoothing his mustache before speaking. The room smelled of wine casks, stale smoke, and wet wool drying by the wall. Restrepo laid the auction record before him and tapped the entry with one thick finger. "I want her returned," he said. The lawyer read the page. "You sold her in public." "For 1 silver coin." "That is unfortunate," the man replied, "but still a sale." Restrepo leaned closer. "Then find me another road." A road was found, not an honest one, but one that could wear decent clothes in daylight. The lawyer proposed a claim that the wrong enslaved woman had been transferred at auction, that a clerical confusion in the lot had caused a mistaken sale. If accepted, the transaction could be challenged, and the woman reclaimed as property entered in error. It was thin, it was ugly, but it gave Pride a paper shield, and that was enough for Restrepo. While this was being prepared, life in Leoncio's house moved on in a gentler key, unaware for a little while of what was gathering beyond its walls. Belisaria added coriander and thyme to the herb bed. Leoncio brought home a glazed jar from the market, blue around the lip because the clay dried less quickly in it. Once he returned with his sleeve carrying the scent of rain and laid on the table a small packet of annatto seeds because he thought she might know what to do with them. She did. That night the kitchen smelled warm and red and deep. Little trusts kept building. He no longer hesitated before speaking to her as though she understood everything, because she did. She no longer hid every old token after using it. Some remained in the cedar box, some on the tray by the window. One or two even left carelessly on the study table overnight, which, in her case, was its own kind of daring. Then, on a morning washed bright after rain, while drops still clung to the patio leaves and the flagstones shone damp underfoot, a rider from town knocked at the gate, carrying a folded legal notice sealed in cheap wax. Leoncio broke it open in the doorway. Belisaria, standing a few steps away with wet earth on her hands from the herb bed, saw his face alter before he had finished reading. When he looked up at her, the paper still open in his hand, she knew the past had found the house at last. He folded the notice once, very carefully, as though rough hands might make its contents worse. The morning had been clear a moment earlier. Now, even the bright patio seemed altered. Water still shone on the stones from the dawn washing, and the herb beds smelled fresh where Belisaria had been loosening soil around the roots. But fear can change a place faster than weather does. She stood with damp earth on her fingers, watching Leoncio's face while the messenger waited awkwardly by the gate, cap in hand, pretending not to listen. "It is from the civil court," Leoncio said at last. That was enough to drain the warmth from her features. He dismissed the rider, closed the gate, and led her inside to the study before he said more. There, among the cedar box, the tray of tokens, and the neat stacks of patrol papers, the folded sheet looked filthy to her simply because it had come from Restrepo's reach. Leoncio read it through again, slower this time. The claim was exactly as ugly as Pride would make it. The wrong enslaved woman had allegedly been transferred at auction. A clerical mistake, a confusion of lot and name. The sale, therefore, should be questioned, and the woman returned to her former owner pending review. Returned. There are words that strike harder than blows. Belisaria did not sit. She backed one step toward the wall, as if the room itself had shifted under her feet. Her breathing grew shallow. Leoncio noticed at once that her eyes had gone, not blank, but very old. It was the look of someone who had learned too young that safety can vanish between 1 hour and the next. "No," he said firmly before panic could root itself more deeply. "Listen to me. This is paper. Paper can lie." She looked at him, trembling once at the hands, and then turned to the study table. With more haste than he had ever seen from her, she took up a piece of clay and pressed into it the outline of a narrow body behind bars. Beside it, she scratched a mounted man, and above him, a jagged mark like a broken seal. When she set it down, the token was still wet enough to shine. Fear and power. Captivity brought back by law. Leoncio felt anger rise in him, cold and clean. He wants to shame me and reclaim what he sold because now he thinks he sold too cheaply. That is all this is. He placed his hand flat on the notice. I will answer it. But Belisaria was still staring at the little clay figure behind bars. Then she did something she had never done before. She took the cedar box that held her tokens of loss and drew it toward herself with both hands, close against her body, like a child holding the one bundle she cannot bear to leave behind. The gesture was so small, and yet it said everything. She was already bracing to be uprooted again. Leoncio rose from his chair. He did not touch her without warning. He only came near enough that she could see there was no uncertainty in him. Restrepo will have to stand in daylight and prove his lie, he said. Hermogenes signed the register. Half the square saw me by you. The law is often cruel, yes, but it is also vain. It likes records, witnesses, seals, names. We have those. She searched his face as if weighing whether hope was a thing too dangerous to lift again. Outside, a drop of water fell from the roof edge into the cistern with a hollow plink. In the kitchen, something simmering had begun to catch faintly at the bottom of the pot, scenting the corridor with singed spice. Life was continuing, stubbornly, while disaster stood in the room. Belisaria set the cedar box down at last. Then, after a moment's struggle, she reached for a strip of black cord and tied into it one hard knot so tight her knuckles whitened. When she placed it in his hand, Leoncio understood the sign without needing to be taught. Danger was no longer a memory. It had come to the gate. From that day on, the house did not lose its order, but it did lose its ease. Leoncio moved through the rooms with a more deliberate quiet, as men do when they are already planning a defense before the first public blow has landed. The study table filled with papers, the auction register copy, the notice from the court. Notes in his own hand, a list of names who had stood in the square that day and could swear what they saw. Through the open shutters came the smell of sun-warmed plaster and rosemary from the patio, but inside the room the stronger scent was ink, wax, and the dust of old files pulled from shelves. Belisaria did not ask questions in her old way with clay and cord at first. She watched. That was what long danger had taught her to do best. She saw him send a soldier to fetch Hermogenes Pacheco. She saw him write to a clerk he trusted in town. She saw him choose, with great care, the uniform coat he would wear to the hearing. Dark blue, brushed clean, the buttons polished until they caught the light. Message: a man who intended to be taken seriously. Late that afternoon, Hermogenes arrived, smelling of horse, sweat, and the cumin from some stall he had passed too closely on the road. The old auctioneer removed his hat in the entry and listened while Leoncio read the complaint aloud. By the third line, Hermogenes was snorting through his nose. "Wrong woman?" he said. "Nonsense. I called her name from the register myself." "You can testify to that?" "I can testify to the hour, the weather, and which fool in the square coughed while I said it." He jabbed a finger at the paper. "Restrepo is sore because he took 1 silver coin and now believes he sold a hidden treasure without knowing it." Belisaria stood by the doorway holding a tray she had forgotten to set down. She listened to that sentence more sharply than the men realized. Hidden treasure. Strange words for a woman who had once been left standing unsold in public shame. After Hermogenes left, Leoncio finally turned to her. "The hearing will be held in town 3 mornings from now," he said. "You need not enter the chamber if you do not wish to, but I would rather you be near than left here worrying in ignorance." She lowered the tray to the table and took out a clay piece from her apron pocket, one she must have shaped while listening. On it she had pressed a tiny doorway, then beside it 2 marks, one tall, one small. She set the token between them and looked at him steadily. "You go. I remain near." He nodded. Yes. That evening, when the sun had gone red over the tiled roofs and the patio held the day's last warmth, she prepared supper but scarcely tasted her own portion. Afterward, instead of clearing the table at once, she sat near the study threshold and began knotting a fresh black cord with slower, tighter hands than usual. Leoncio, reading over the complaint again by lamplight, glanced up only when he heard the faint sound of the cord being pulled hard against itself. She crossed the room and placed it beside his hand. 3 knots this time. He looked from the cord to her face. 3 dangers? He asked. She touched the paper, then the front door, then, after a pause, she laid her fingers against her own throat. The court, the man who wanted her back, and the old wound that still had not healed enough to bear all this strain. Leoncio closed his hand over the cord. The next morning, before the hearing could even begin, a second paper arrived from town, and this one carried a name on the witness list that made Hermogenes go pale. Hermogenes read the name once, then again, and the skin around his eyes tightened. The paper had arrived folded into a clerk's packet just after sunrise, while mist still clung low in the street outside the gate. Leoncio broke the study table. Belisaria stood near the window, one hand resting on the cedar box without seeming to notice she was doing it. Hermogenes, summoned early so they could ride to town together, bent over the witness list and muttered a curse under his breath when he found the line near the bottom. The name belonged to a former tally clerk from Restrepo's hacienda. According to the paper, the man had left behind a written declaration confirming that Belisaria had been entered by mistake under another woman's place in the lot. "That cannot be," Hermogenes said. Leoncio lifted his eyes. "Because he would not say it?" "Because he is dead." The room went still. Hermogenes tapped the name again with a blunt fingernail. "I knew him. Thin fellow. Coughed like a broken bellows. Buried 2 years ago, if memory serves. Unless he has climbed out of the churchyard to mend Restrepo's books, he signed nothing for this case." Belisaria watched the men, reading their faces more quickly than any document. Leoncio's expression hardened, but not with despair, with clarity. A lie that large, once seen, often carries the seed of its own ruin. "Then we ride," he said. The road into town was already warming when they left. Hooves struck sparks from the stones in the steeper places. Dust rose from the mule traffic ahead of them and hung in the air with the dry smell of leather and sun-baked earth. Belisaria did not ride in front with the men. Leoncio arranged for her to travel in a small covered cart driven by an older soldier's wife, a practical woman from the barracks who asked no foolish questions and kept a water skin ready. Through the parted cloth at the cart opening, Belisaria watched the town approach, every turn of the wheels bringing her closer to a place where others would speak over her fate again. The court chamber was not grand. Most such rooms are not. It smelled of old wood, warm paper, sweat trapped in wool coats, and the candle wax that seeps into everything official. Shutters stood half open against the heat. Flies worried the windows. Leoncio went inside in full uniform, dark blue coat, straight, scar visible over his left brow, posture that of a man who had come to stand and not bend. Belisaria waited beneath the arcade outside, where the shade was thin and the stone bench still held the morning's coolness. She could not hear every word, only fragments carried through the doorway. Restrepo's voice, oily with offense, a lawyer's smoother tone. Hermogenes speaking louder than needed, because old men who have spent 20 years in markets do not know how to testify softly. Time stretches strangely when your life is being measured in a room you are not in. A woman selling sweet cakes passed under the arcade and glanced at Belisaria once, then again. 2 scribes crossed the courtyard with bundles of tied papers. A bell rang from the church tower. Inside, voices rose, fell, then rose again. Belisaria pressed her thumb into a scrap of soft clay she had carried with her, almost without thinking, and marked a single, deep circle into it, over and over, until the edges broke. At last the door opened wider. A court assistant hurried out, face flushed, carrying a ledger in both arms. He nearly collided with her. Behind him, through the gap, she saw Hermogenes standing straight as a spear, and heard him say with sharp certainty, "Your Honor, the dead do not sign declarations." Then came a silence from inside, so heavy that even from the arcade she felt it. Then a moment later, someone in the chamber demanded to know who had forged the paper. The demand inside the chamber did not stay unanswered for long. Belisaria heard chairs scrape, then a burst of overlapping voices, then the dry, commanding tone of the judge cutting through them all. She could not make out every word from the arcade, but she no longer needed the whole of it. Some truths announce themselves by the silence they create afterward. The hush that fell inside was the hush of men realizing a lie had stepped too far into daylight. Minutes later, Hermogenes came out first, face red from heat and indignation, but with a spark in his eye that had not been there before. He did not stop. He only passed close enough to mutter, "Stay where you are. This is turning." Belisaria sat very still on the stone bench, the broken-edged clay scrap in her hand now hardened by the warmth of her palm. A fly circled her veil and drifted off. Down in the courtyard, a dog slept in a patch of sun, as if no one's life were being unmade and remade a few paces away. Such is the cruelty of the ordinary world. It goes on even when your heart is standing at a doorway. Inside, the hearing sharpened. The judge had ordered the dates checked against the burial record. A clerk ran to the registry room. Another brought in the death ledger. Restrepo's lawyer, so polished in the tavern, sounded far less smooth when asked how a dead man had come to produce a fresh declaration. Leoncio spoke only when needed, and when he did, it was with the calm force of a man who knows noise often weakens the truth instead of strengthening it. At last, the door opened again, and this time Leoncio himself stepped into the light. He crossed the arcade toward Belisaria with the expression he wore after a difficult campaign. Not triumph, yet, but certainty. "The statement is broken," he said in a low voice meant only for her. "The dead clerk's burial entry is on the judge's desk. Restrepo's counsel has no answer to it." She closed her eyes once. Her shoulders dropped the smallest measure. But one stone had shifted. Then the judge called them back. Belisaria did not enter. She remained beneath the arcade while the chambers swallowed Leoncio again. Through the open doorway she caught glimpses only. Hermogenes standing square, hand lifted as he swore to the sale. Restrepo stiff and swollen with offended pride. The judge leafing through pages with growing impatience. Wax seals, ink, dust moving in the light. The ruling, when it came, was brief enough that even from outside she felt its finality. The original sale stood. The claim of mistaken transfer was dismissed. The fraudulent paper would be noted, and the court reserved the right to pursue further penalty if evidence of fabrication was confirmed. Restrepo was ordered to cease interference in the matter. His attempt had failed. For a heartbeat, Belisaria did not react at all. Some people who have lived too long under threat cannot trust good news until it has sat in the room a while. Then Leoncio emerged once more, and this time he gave one plain nod. She understood. The air moved back into her lungs so suddenly it almost hurt. But if you think a proud man walks away from public humiliation chastened, you have not known enough proud men. Restrepo came out last. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at his lawyer. He looked at Belisaria. There are stares that touch the skin like cold metal. This was one of them. No shouting, no scene under the arcade, only that look, dark with the rage of a man who believes he has been made small before witnesses. Leoncio stepped between them at once, subtle enough for the crowd not to call it a challenge, plain enough that Restrepo could not mistake it. Restrepo turned and descended the courthouse steps. Yet even while he left, something in the set of his shoulders said he was not carrying defeat away from town. He was carrying it home, where men like him often begin planning worse things. The ride home from town took place under a sky too clear for the mood they carried back with them. The legal danger had been pushed aside, yes, but not destroyed. Humiliation leaves a scent some men cannot endure on their own skin. By the time the gate of the house closed behind them, Leoncio's relief had already hardened into caution. Belisaria felt it too. Victory can sound at first too much like a door not quite latched. That evening the rooms seemed to listen. The kitchen was warm with stew and toasted chili, yet even the familiar smells did not ease the strain. Leoncio checked the bolt at the front gate himself. He walked the patio wall with a lamp after sunset, the flame wavering gold across plaster and stone. He sent word quietly to 2 trusted men from the detachment to keep a closer watch on the road for several nights, but he did not make a display of it. He knew fear grows larger when fed publicly. Belisaria returned to her old habits in small ways. She left the pantry door open while she worked. She chose the stool nearest the kitchen threshold. Twice, when a mule brayed suddenly from a neighboring yard, her shoulders drew tight before she could help them. Later, she carried a black cord to the study and set it beside Leoncio's hand without explanation. He touched the knot and said, "You feel it too." She gave one slow nod. The nights that followed were restless ones, not with attacks, not yet, but with all the little things that make a house begin to doubt the dark. Hoofbeats heard too late on the road and then gone. Dogs barking beyond the orchard wall. Once, near midnight, a stable boy swore he saw 2 riders pause on the rise and watch the house before turning back. Leoncio questioned him carefully, then said nothing of it to alarm Belisaria. She knew anyway. People who have lived under threat do not need formal warnings. Their bodies know first. On the 4th night after the hearing, the air changed. It was dry, brittle, carrying dust even after sunset. The moon rose thin and pale above the tiled roofs. In the yard, the horses were unsettled before anyone else noticed why, tossing their heads at sounds still too faint for human ears. Leoncio had been in the study reviewing dispatches by lamplight when one of the dogs began barking in a deep, furious rhythm, not at some stray cat or passing traveler, but at men who meant to come closer. He was on his feet at once. Belisaria, who had been rinsing bowls in the kitchen, looked up at the same moment. She did not need words to understand danger had arrived in flesh and bone, not paper. Leoncio crossed to the wall rack and took down his pistol. The small metallic click of it being readied seemed to cut the whole house in 2, before and after. From outside came the thud of hooves, then a man's voice raised in drunken boldness. "Open in the name of rightful property!" Restrepo. Even through thick wood and stone, she knew that voice. Leoncio turned to her. His face was calm, but it was the calm of a man stepping into violence he had already expected. "Stay inside," he said. "Bar the kitchen door once I am out. Whatever you hear, you do not come out unless I call for you." She stared at him. He came 1 step closer. "Do you understand?" Belisaria nodded, though every line of her body said she hated the command. Then the first blow struck the outer gate. Wood shuddered. Horses screamed in the stable. Somewhere in the yard another voice shouted, and just after that came the crash of something glass against stone, followed by the terrible instant smell of spilled oil catching flame. The smell hit first, sharp oil, hot metal, and then the dry, hungry breath of fire finding wood. Leoncio had barely reached the courtyard when flame leapt low and fast along the spilled lamp fuel near the outer wall. One of Restrepo's hired men must have hurled it in the dark, thinking to sow confusion, perhaps never imagining how quickly such carelessness can turn into ruin. The gate shook again under another blow. Dogs lunged and barked. Horses tore at their halters in the stable. Above it all came Restrepo's voice, ragged now with drink and fury, shouting that he had been cheated and would take back what was his. Inside the kitchen, Belisaria slammed the bar across the door exactly as Leoncio had ordered. Then she stood with both hands pressed to the wood, hearing everything through it. Men's boots on stone. A pistol shot cracking into the night to drive someone back. The wild pounding of hooves from the stable yard. Smoke already sneaking under the cracks. Every sound collided with some older terror inside her, until time seemed to split, half in the present, half in that other night long ago, when men had dragged away what she loved, and no one could stop them. Another crash. A mule screamed. That sound tore through her harder than the voices did. She turned from the door and ran to the kitchen window that faced the rear buildings. Through the black frame, she saw it at once. The granary beside the stable had caught. Fire climbed the dry timbers in orange strips, racing upward with the wind. Grain dust glittered in the light like swarming sparks. The roof edge glowed, then flared. Inside, trapped animals threw themselves against wood and iron with desperate force. Leoncio had meant to keep the attack away from the house. He had not seen the blaze spread to the granary. Outside in the front yard, he was still forcing back the intruders, his pistol in one hand, sword in the other, while two of his men from the road watch, alerted by the noise, came running through the side lane. Belisaria understood two things at once. The colonel did not know yet what was happening behind him, and if no one reached that building now, the beasts inside would burn alive. She did not stop to think beyond that. There was an old cloth by the wash basin. She seized it, plunged it into the water jar, wrapped it over her mouth and nose, then tore the kitchen bar back off the door with both hands. Smoke met her in the yard. Heat struck her face before she had taken 3 steps. Over the wall she could hear men shouting, but the world had narrowed to the granary door and the pounding from within it. The latch was hot enough to bite her skin. She grabbed it anyway. Inside, the air was half cinders already. 2 mules rolled their eyes white in the thick dark, bodies slamming against their tethers. Belisaria coughed once behind the wet cloth, stumbled forward, and worked at the first knot with burning fingers. The animal kicked, then broke free and plunged past her into the yard. She got the second loose moments later. It burst outward too, nearly throwing her off her feet as it fled through sparks and smoke. Then the roof groaned. Not loudly at first. A deep, splintering complaint overhead, the sound of weight changing where weight should not move. Belisaria turned toward the doorway she had just cleared and saw a black beam shudder loose above the entrance. Outside, somewhere beyond the roar, Leoncio heard a different shout and looked back at last. The granary was fully aflame, and she was still inside it. He ran before he had fully thought, and perhaps that was mercy. When Leoncio saw the granary door vanish behind flame and smoke, the rest of the yard fell away from him. Restrepo, the hired men, even the pistol in his hand ceased to matter for one terrible instant. One of his soldiers shouted that 2 raiders were fleeing toward the road. Another called for water lines. None of it reached him whole. He only heard the roar of burning grain and knew she was inside it. "Belisaria!" he shouted. For 15 years, that name had never once drawn a spoken answer from her. He knew that. He shouted it anyway, voice breaking ragged in the heat, as he threw himself toward the collapsing doorway. Sparks stung his face. Smoke slapped the breath from his chest. A half-burned beam had fallen low across the entrance, and behind it, the fire had already turned the air into something alive and murderous. Inside, Belisaria had stumbled backward when the beam came down. The wet cloth over her mouth was no longer cool. It smelled of soot and scorched linen. Smoke crawled into her nose and throat no matter how tightly she held the cloth. Around her, sacks of grain were splitting open with dull bursts, spilling kernels that popped and blackened in the heat. The roof timbers groaned overhead. She could not see the doorway clearly anymore, only red light and moving shadow. Then she heard him, her name in his voice, as fear, as need, as if the thought of losing her had torn something open in him. She tried to answer at once, but her throat locked. 15 years is a long time to keep a door closed inside the body. She coughed instead, dropped to one knee and groped blindly through smoke thick as wool. The world shrank to burning lungs, raw eyes, and the knowledge that if she did not make him find her now, the silence she had chosen as a child would become her grave. Outside, Leoncio pushed at the fallen beam with both hands and could not move it far enough. Fire ran over it in bright tongues. The skin of his palms blistered almost at once. He did not feel it. "Belisaria!" he called again, hoarse now, half prayer and half command to the dark itself. And inside, something gave way. Not the roof, not yet. Something older. Something bound the night her mother's cart had disappeared. Belisaria opened her mouth against the smoke and forced sound through a throat that had forgotten it. The first attempt came out as a scrape, almost nothing. She gathered herself again, every memory of loss and fear and stubborn survival breaking loose at once, and cried the only word that mattered in the moment. Leoncio! The name came rough, cracked, nearly torn from her, but it crossed the fire cleanly. He heard it. He heard it, and for the briefest instant the entire burning yard seemed to stop around that single sound. She had spoken. She had called him. There was no mistaking where it came from now. He shoved the beam again with a strength born from terror, heaved it high enough to crawl under, and plunged into the red-black smoke. Inside, he found her on the dirt floor, one hand outstretched, hair half fallen loose, face streaked with soot and tears the heat had forced from her eyes. He caught her under the shoulders just as another timber cracked overhead. "Hold on," he said, though she could barely hear him. Then the roof gave a second warning groan, deeper and final, and he had only heartbeats left to drag her back out before the whole granary came down on both of them. He got her out with the roof already falling behind them. Leoncio dragged Belisaria beneath the smoking beam, half pulling, half carrying, her shoes scraping through spilled grain and cinders as the granary groaned above their heads like a ship breaking apart at sea. The heat on his back was so fierce it felt as though the fire itself had taken hold of his coat. Then they were through the doorway, stumbling into the yard, just as the roof gave way in a rush of sparks and burning timbers that crashed down where they had been heartbeats earlier. They hit the ground hard. For several moments there was nothing in the world but coughing, ash, and the terrible labor of breathing. Leoncio rolled onto one elbow and gathered her against him with one arm, as if his body could still shield hers from what had already nearly happened. Her hair smelled of smoke. Her hands were scorched red across the palms and fingers. The damp cloth had fallen from her face. Soot streaked her cheeks in dark lines cut through by tears she had not chosen. "You are safe," he said, though his own chest was heaving. "Do you hear me? Safe." Belisaria coughed again, then looked up at him through streaming eyes. Because the door inside her had already been broken open by fire, the next word came easier than the first, though it was faint and ragged from smoke. "Leoncio." He froze. Not because he had imagined it, because he had not. The sound of her voice, hoarse and human, and entirely her own, struck him with a force no musket ball ever had. Around them, men were still shouting, hauling water, chasing down the last of Restrepo's scattered riders. Somewhere a horse kicked loose from a rope. None of it reached him clearly. He was staring at her as if the whole burning night had narrowed to that single impossible thing. She swallowed painfully, winced, and whispered one more word. "Stay." It was such a small plea, and yet it carried 15 years of silence behind it. "I am here," he answered at once, bending close so she would not have to strain. "I am not leaving you." By then, the practical world forced itself back in. A sergeant came running to report that Restrepo had fled with the remaining men toward the western road. Another shouted that the fire was contained to the granary and stable wall, though half the grain was lost. A servant woman knelt with a basin of water and cloths. Someone brought blankets. The night smelled of wet ash now, charred wood and trampled earth. The attack was ending, but its mark would remain. Leoncio did not leave her side even then. They carried her into the main room, where the portrait of Casimira looked down above the flickering lamplight, and the shutters stood open to let smoke drift out. Her burned hands were bathed gently. A local physician was fetched before dawn, an older man with sleepy eyes and quick, competent fingers. He examined the blisters, listened to her chest, and ordered rest, cool water, honey for the throat, linen wraps with salve for the hands. All the while, Leoncio remained close enough that when she opened her eyes between exhaustion and pain, he would be the first thing she saw. When the physician asked where it hurt most, Belisaria tried to answer and managed only a broken breath. He thought it was weakness. Leoncio knew better now. He leaned nearer. "Slowly," he said. "There is no hurry." She looked at him, gathered what little strength remained in her, and shaped two halting words that no one in that house had ever expected to hear spoken from her mouth. "Water, please." The physician blinked in open astonishment. Leoncio gave the cup to her with hands that were not entirely steady. By sunrise, the flames had burned down to black ruin. Restrepo was gone, and the first rumor had already begun running through the town that the silent woman had spoken in the fire, and spoken the colonel's name. By the second day after the fire, the house had fallen into a new kind of quiet. This one was tender, watchful, full of punishments around pain and wonder. The granary still smoldered in the yard, sending up a bitter smell of wet ash whenever the wind shifted. Men came and went, carrying charred boards, checking the stable wall, counting what grain had been lost and what tools might be saved. But inside the main room, where the shutters stood half open to let in air, the world had narrowed to linen bandages, clay cups of cool water, honey stirred into broth, and the rough, new shape of a voice returning. Belisaria lay propped on cushions beneath the window, her hands wrapped in salve-soaked cloth. The physician had forbidden much speaking for the throat, and that suited her as much as it suited him. Yet silence now was no longer a sealed chamber. It had a door in it. Sometimes she answered with a whisper, sometimes with a nod. Sometimes, out of old habit, she still reached for a token or a chord when the effort of sound felt too great. Leoncio accepted all of it. He read dispatches near her instead of in the study. He cooled water himself when the servants were occupied. Once, when she woke from a troubled sleep with soot-darkened lashes wet against her skin, he said only, "You are here," and that was enough to bring her fully back. The physician returned on the third morning and changed the wraps on her hands. "The throat will mend if she does not force it," he said, glancing between them with a look halfway between professional caution and private astonishment. "As for the speech, that is no matter of medicine I can claim credit for." After he left, Leoncio stood a long moment beside the table where the cedar box and her old cords still rested. Then he opened a drawer in the writing desk and drew out a packet bound with ribbon and sealed in red wax. Belisaria looked at it at once. The seal was official, court wax. He brought the packet to her carefully, as though it held something more breakable than paper. "I had already begun the petition before the raid," he said. "The attack only hastened what I should have done sooner. These are not finished yet. They still require the last formal entries in town, but the papers are in motion." Her breath caught. He sat beside her and laid the packet within reach, not pressing it into her hands because the bandages would not allow it. "When they return complete," he said, "they will state before any magistrate, any soldier, any man who thinks himself powerful, that no claim remains over your person. Freedom has a sound even before it arrives." In that room, it sounded like paper shifting under red wax. Belisaria stared at the seal for a long while. Then, very slowly, she lifted her bandaged hand and touched the packet with her fingertips. When she spoke, the words came haltingly, but clear enough. "For me?" Leoncio's face changed in a way she had never seen fully before, stripped of command, stripped even of caution. "For you," he said. "And because I will not have your future rest on gratitude alone." She looked at him then, truly looked, while the wind outside stirred ash from the ruined granary and carried with it the scent of scorched grain, rosemary, and rain threatening far off. Whatever answer rose in her did not come at once. Instead, before she could shape it, a rider hammered at the front gate with urgent fists, and a soldier's voice called that town officials had arrived, with witnesses, sealed statements, and news of what Restrepo had done after fleeing the fire. The knock at the gate carried none of the wildness of the raid. It was official, measured, and for that very reason it made the room hold its breath. Leoncio went himself. From her place by the window, Belisaria could hear the murmur of men's voices in the entry, boots on stone, the rustle of papers being unfolded with importance. When he returned, he was not alone. With him came a town clerk in travel dust, a militia sergeant, and Hermogenes Pacheco, who looked as though he had ridden hard and argued harder. The clerk carried a leather case tied with cord. The sergeant carried 2 written depositions sealed in wax. Hermogenes carried outrage like a lantern. "It is done," the old auctioneer said before even sitting down. "Or near enough to done." The clerk, more formal, bowed his head toward Belisaria before speaking. "Statements have been taken from one of Restrepo's hired men and from a groom at the posting yard, where they changed horses after the attack. Both place him at the scene. Both describe the lamp thrown toward the granary, and the advocate who filed the false claim has abandoned him entirely." The room smelled of damp wool, old ash drifting in from the yard, and hot broth cooling untouched on the side table. Leoncio listened without interrupting. The sergeant added that Restrepo's standing in town had already suffered. Merchants were refusing easy credit. Men who once drank with him had suddenly remembered other errands. The forged court paper was now part of the record. The raft had made the rest impossible to hide. At last, the clerk opened the leather case and took out a folded packet with larger seals than the one Leoncio had shown her before. Real seals. Official seals. Dark red, stamped deep. "These," he said, "bear the final approvals." Belisaria stared. Red-waxed manumission papers. The words were not spoken aloud by the clerk, but everyone in the room understood them. Hermogenes, who had seen too many lives reduced to columns and prices, went unexpectedly quiet. Leoncio took the packet with both hands and waited until the others had withdrawn to the courtyard before turning back to her. When they were alone again, he came to the chair by her window and knelt, so she would not have to lift her voice or her bandaged hands. "You must hear this plainly," he said. He broke the seals, unfolded the papers, and read them aloud in a steady tone. Her name, her legal release, the nullification of all prior claim, the recognition that no man might henceforth buy, sell, transfer, or seize her person as property. The words were dry in the clerk's manner, but in that room they sounded like a bell struck after years underground. When he finished, he placed the papers in her lap. "You are free," he said. "Whatever comes after this, it must be because you choose it. If you wish to leave this house, I will see you provided for. If you wish to remain here, you will remain by your own will. I do not want gratitude mistaken for devotion. And I will not take from you with kindness what others once took by force." Belisaria looked down at the pages, then up at him. Her voice was still tender, rough at the edges, but it no longer frightened her the way it had days before. "If I stay," she asked slowly, "would I stay as what?" Leoncio's breath caught, just once. He answered with the honesty that had marked him from the beginning. "If you stayed as my guest, I would be honored. If you stayed as the keeper of this house, I would be grateful. And if God were far kinder to me than I deserve." He stopped there, because some truths once begun cannot be spoken carelessly. Belisaria held his gaze. Then she gathered the manumission papers against her chest, drew one careful breath, and asked the question that would decide the shape of everything left in both their lives. "Would you have me as your wife?" For a moment after she asked it, even the ash-scented air seemed to stand still. Leoncio did not answer quickly, because he was an honest man. That pause did not wound her. It honored the question. He took one breath, then another, looking at the woman before him as the same person who had crossed a market square unwanted, entered his house in silence, and then called him back to life from inside a burning granary. "Yes," he said at last, and his voice was low, steady, utterly without flourish. "Yes, if you choose it in freedom, and never for shelter alone. Yes, if you can bear a man who comes to you late in life with scars, ashes, and more gratitude than grace. Yes. Belisaria closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was no hesitation in them. Then, yes, she whispered. The wedding was held some weeks later, after her hands had healed enough to fasten a sleeve and lift a cup without pain, and after the final entries had been made in town so no future quarrel could stain the day. It was better than grand. The church smelled of wax, old wood, and white flowers gathered from 3 neighboring courtyards. Hermogenes came scrubbed and solemn, wearing a coat too warm for the season. The physician attended. So did 2 soldiers from the detachment, each looking more moved than a man in uniform likes to appear. Even Eulalia, older and slower now, arrived in a borrowed cart from the family she served, and cried openly the moment she saw Belisaria standing in the aisle with her hair braided and a narrow ribbon at her throat. When the priest asked her vow, she did not lower her gaze. Her voice was still marked by the fire, softer than before life had taken it from her, yet clear enough to fill the chapel. She answered plainly, with no trembling left in it. A murmur passed through the benches then, not mockery, not pity, wonder. The same town that had once watched men price her in public now listened in reverent silence while she gave her own answer before God. But Restrepo did not come. He had other concerns by then. The forged declaration remained in the record. The raid and the lamp were traced back through frightened hired men who discovered that loyalty dries up quickly when prison or ruin begins to show itself. Creditors pressed him. Trade partners withdrew. Doors that once opened to him out of habit began opening a moment too slowly, or not at all. He was not carried off in chains to satisfy a storybook taste for punishment. It was worse for a man like him. He was left standing inside the wreckage of his own name. As for the house, it changed in visible ways. The ruined granary was cleared and rebuilt in stone at the base, with better spacing from the stable and a wider yard well between them. The red-waxed manumission papers were wrapped in linen and kept in a carved box near the desk, simply present, like a foundation deed for the life that followed. Leoncio began teaching her letters in the evenings, tracing words first with chalk, then with ink. Belisaria, who had once spoken only in clay and cord, learned to write her own name in a careful, patient hand. In time, there were children in the house after all, though not by birth. A fever season took a widow and her husband in a village outside town, leaving behind a small girl who hated the dark and a boy who bit anyone that tried to comfort him. Belisaria and Leoncio brought them home. The girl learned herbs first. The boy learned the stable faster than letters. Both learned, without being told, that this was a house where no one's fear would be mocked. Years later, on a damp spring morning, tiny green shoots rose from the soil beside the rebuilt wall where old ash had been turned into the garden bed. Belisaria stood there with a basket on her arm, calling the children in for supper, her voice carrying easily across the yard. What fire had blackened had fed the roots instead. If this story stayed with you, leave a word for Belisaria in the comments, and stay close to the channel for the next tale.